I'm going to bet if you're a card maker, your gateway into this amazing craft was heat embossing. It's mesmerizing to watch and adds dimension, texture, and a touch of sparkle or shine to your card projects. There are many different types of embossing powders on the market, and everyone has their own unique way of doing things. But today I'm sharing my top 5 techniques to achieve amazing results. Plus, I'll be sharing some bonus tips along the way. All of my supplies I'm using today will be linked in the video description down below. And if you find value in this video, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Now, on to the video. I'm going to be using some products from Simon Says Stamp to create my card project today, starting with the Exotic Blooms die. This is a beautiful focal point that I'll be using for my card. I'm going to use the Outline Hearts stamp set. This is a clear background stamp that I'll be doing the heat embossing with. I have the All My Love reverse sentiment strips. And then I didn't show, or I don't use this, but I did want to show you that this is the Outline Hearts stencil, which can be used on its own or it lines up over the Outline Hearts stamp set. Now, my first tip that I'm going to share with you is to condition your stamp. Whatever stamp you plan on using for heat embossing, condition it with embossing ink or your hand, or there are even some stamp erasers that are safe to use to condition it. Mine is already conditioned, so that's why you're not seeing that on screen, but it is a very important step. There are also numerous ways that you can stamp a background stamp. This is just how I prefer to do it because I do plan on stamping it multiple times. Now, my second tip is going to be to prep your cardstock. You want to use some sort of anti-static powder tool to prep the cardstock so that way you don't have the embossing powder sticking to areas that you don't want it to stick to. So I'm conditioning that really well. Now, a bonus tip here is that you can use pigment ink to ink up your stamps and do heat embossing. Now, I am using the Simon Says Stamp clear ink to do this. It is a very popular and well used ink, the clear embossing ink in any brand. But if I were to be doing white heat embossing with white embossing powder, I would use a white pigment ink. Pigment ink stays wet for a longer period of time, which makes it great for adding your embossing powder. That is why clear ink is so popular is that you can use any color of embossing powder and it stays wet for a little while. Now, this is also kind of a bonus is that I like to stamp my images at least 2 to 3 times to make sure it is transferring to the cardstock really well. So that's just kind of a bonus tip. You don't have to. If you feel like you got a good impression the first time, you definitely can stop there. My third tip is going to be tap, tap, tap. And the reason I say that is that I have my cardstock kind of parallel with my work surface. I'm sprinkling on the embossing powder and then I'm tapping underneath it to kind of shake the embossing powder around a little bit. I'm not dumping it right away onto the scratch paper. I'm kind of giving it a little tap underneath, letting that really settle into that embossing ink. And then I can shake it off onto some scratch cardstock. Tip number 4 is have your heat tool warming up. I wait at least a minute, if not longer, to get my heat gun really nice and hot. So when I come to my cardstock, it immediately starts melting. And then also moving into step number 5 is you want to move fairly quickly once you see that embossing powder melting. So it's going from that dull color to this bright gold, move on. If you sit too long in one area, you are going to overheat your embossing ink, or I'm sorry, embossing powder, which is going to make it not look very good. So you want to just kind of melt it and move on. But you do want to make sure you are covering all of the area. You don't want to miss any of them, which is very easy to tell because you can see there is a huge difference of kind of that dull powder look to the actual melted powder. And then the last thing I do is I let that cool for at least 20 to 30 seconds. If you do not let your embossing powder cool after heating it, you can risk smearing it because you melted it. And so if it is not cooled off, you're going to smear it and have to start all over. Now I let it cool and then I buffed over it with a Swiffer cloth to remove any of that excess powder. Now that all of my embossing is done, I'm going to move on to creating a card with that background. So I'm starting with the Exotic Blooms die. So this is a two-piece die set, and I'm going to dig out some cardstock. This is the Pearlescent cardstock from Lawn Fawn. I also have some matte gold cardstock that I'm going to be die cutting from. This is from Simon Says Stamp. And then the last thing I have here is the 120-pound cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. Super heavyweight. I'm going to use it to create a card base. So I'm scoring that at 4 1/4. So this is going to end up being an A2 size card front. And then I just score it, fold it, and reinforce that fold with the bone folder. I trimmed my cardstock pieces down because I really don't need that big of a piece since these are kind of small. And I'm going to be using my mini Intri-Cut die cut machine from Gina K Designs. So I put both of the dies on here. I do recommend maybe just doing one at a time. You don't want to risk the chance of your dies shifting and overlapping each other because you could ruin them. And plus, it gets pretty tough to do both of them at once. So I would suggest doing one at a time. Now, these are going to be the stem, the leaves, and the flowers from the pearlescent. The stamens, I'm just going to be using from the matte gold cardstock. Off screen, I had also die cut out those exact same pieces from the 120-pound cardstock, so that way I can layer them together to create some dimension, which I will show you how I do that here in just a second. I'm going to pop everything out with my die release pick, and then I have my media mat here. This is just like a grip mat or a silicone mat that I like to use to glue on top of. It's really easy to clean up, and I have just one die cut piece from white cardstock and then my top layer from the pearlescent cardstock. And I'm layering them together using my reverse tweezers and my connect glue that I have in a fine tip bottle. This die actually creates two different flowers going one in each direction, and I'm just using the larger of the two. The petal has two pieces to it. There is a base piece, and then the front piece has some embossed lines. It's kind of etched into it. And I'm going to slide that stamen right in between the two. So it's poking up just a little bit. And I thought that matte gold would tie in nicely with my gold heat embossing. I love a good heat embossed background, but I do want to trim this panel down just a little bit. So I am going to use an A2 layers die from Waffle Flower, and I want to have a really nice thick white margin going around my card front. I think that's going to help kind of draw the eye into the center where my small sentiment is going to be. So I'm lining that up with my die and my background. I'm going to hold that down with some washi tape and run that through my die cut machine. I'm going to add a little bit of dimension to this by trimming down some white foam. This is, I think, like a pop up die cutting foam from Spellbinders. I trimmed it down to be just a little bit smaller than my panel, and I'm going to add some liquid glue to that and then add my cardstock piece on top. Now, another thing with heat embossing is sometimes it can kind of warp your paper a little bit. So, this craft foam is going to help kind of straighten and flatten all that out. Now, once I add it to my card front, I am going to set something heavy on top of that and let that sit for a little bit. While that is sitting, I am picking out a sentiment. I really like these reverse sentiments from Simon Says Stamp. They have just a ton of different ones, and I keep them in these little storage pockets to keep them all organized. I picked out one that was actually already kind of trimmed out, but I want it to be just a little bit skinnier. So I'm using one of my scratch cardstock pieces that I did my die cutting from, and I'm adding post-it tape behind it so that the sticky side of the post-it tape is facing up, and then I'm placing my little strip on top of that. So as long as all the edges on that scrap cardstock piece are straight, this is going to work. I line it up in my mini paper trimmer and just trim off a sliver. So my cardstock scrap is kind of helping me get that in there because this is such a small little strip. Then I can just clean up my edges and trim those off as well. Now that my background is ready, I am going to layer on my flower. So I started with the stem and the leaves, adding the liquid glue to that and placing that kind of in the center of my background. I have the top of the flower there as just a placement guide. And then for the flower, I am going to pop that up. So I have some thin white foam squares from Simon Says Stamp that I'm placing on the top of the petals because the base is going to overlap that stem just a little bit. So I'm going to trim some of these down with my scissors. Then I can just peel off the backing and add that over the top. And it is just enough of a lift to keep it off of that stem. The thin foam squares are one of my absolute favorite type of foam squares. For the sentiment, these are kind of a white core based sentiment. So I am taking a black Copic marker and I go around all of the edges to give that more of a finished look. And then I'm going to take some black foam squares. These are also the thin ones. And I'm going to add it to each of the ends. Now, also keep in mind that these reverse sentiment strips are foilable. So you could place some deco foil over the top and run these through whether it be your fuse or your mini mink, and you could also foil them. I'm going to embellish it with some gold pearls, and this part I don't show a lot in my videos, but I do this almost every single time I add embellishments. Is I have these triangle trays that I usually will kind of put some of my embellishments in, and then I grab any type of waxy tip tool or a pick and stick tool, anything like that. I sift through it, I pick out the ones that I want, and I place them onto the cardstock or the card front. And I love the triangle trays because then I don't have to dig in the bag. I don't have them spilling all over my work surface, and I can easily dump them back into their container. So now that I have my embellishments picked out and I lined them up where I wanted them to go, I can put down a little dot of that liquid glue and pop on my embellishment. Heat embossing is absolutely magical and can be used in so many different card making techniques. This is just one of the easiest ways to use it. Now, if you are interested in any more videos that have to do with heat embossing or heat embossing techniques, you can find them here in this video. Thanks for watching.